Thank you very much, August-san. Yeah, so I am extremely delighted to report you that T7 Japan 2023 has just uploaded T7 Japan communique. And also this printed version is available. And the slide お願いします。
Can I have the slides, please?
そうですね、そうか、私、ここに見ればいいんだ。Okay, so, and then I'm also happy that finally we have reached the final session together with my respected colleagues. So we will have a very interesting discussion about the future of T7 and T20. And then this is about the communique. So you can, right now you can get the communique using this QR code. So in this communique, there are lots of policy proposals about 30-something the view. Nicola, what's the name? View statement, position statement, or view statement, vision statement. Yeah, I thought something wrong with my okay, vision statement plus 40 something policy recommendations. But important point would be that communique proposes the collaboration between T7 and the T20, and also think tank group, and other engagement groups. Because there are many reasons, and one of them is that with this, world, we are living in a world at crisis and risk, and then I think it's important to increase the momentum or those things of the kind of track to diplomacy. So not only government people, but also the private sector people should communicate each other. And because of the geopolitical tension and conflicts, it's difficult for governments to discuss in some cases, but the private sector people, researchers, can discuss each other. Then, of course, there are many human exchanges in the world, but think tanks are relatively close to the government and then proposing policies. So we have channel with the government. So and the government and then think tanks, and then this side, that side, and then another side of government, we can create new channels of communication. I think that those communication channels will make the world safer. And then also, we are facing the more long-term challenges like climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. And then to solve these, that are not only the question, but many other difficult and challenging issues. Then it is very important to get good ideas, good views, good information, good data from the world. For that purpose, the collaboration, network, so very important. So for that purpose, we need to have more and more collaboration. We need to find common interests and commonalities, not just emphasizing the differences. Of course, differences exist. That's matter of course, but we need to find commonalities to start collaboration. Okay? So that's why our communique focuses on those, the common interest. And then common interest number one is yesterday, as Professor Bamban said yesterday, the Agenda 2030, because all the countries in the world agreed on to implement it, right? Implement that agenda. But and then, well, of course, there are more urgent issues like debt crisis and food crisis, energy crisis. So this communique addresses the kind of those urgent issues as well. But then it turns to the Agenda 2030, and then how to achieve Agenda 2030. We propose the two things. One is more gender equality, because women and girls are very important, human capital, which is eventually the engine of the development. So, and then also children will be the engine of the development in the future, and then the women and also men work together very, closely to create new capital. I mean the high quality human capital for the global development, sustainable development in the future. For that purpose, gender equality and women and girls empowerment is very important, the key. And then another is measurement of well-being, human well-being, because SDGs, many goals are about, essentially all goals are about the human well-being, right, eventually. But we have very sufficient indicators about the achievement of the efforts in that direction. Right? So only the common measurement or measures is GDP. So that bias the direction of efforts, and if we have much better measure of human well-being, then the people work hard on the improving that measure, indicators, numbers, and then because of integrating all the efforts of the people to that direction, we can have much higher probability of achieving the SDGs in time. So, developing that kind of the new indicator beyond GDP is very difficult. But the idea is as old as I am, or older than I am, but still we don't have very good measure or indicator yet. So, but compared with decades ago, the situation is much better because of the new technologies, right? So we have the chance, lots of chance to have a better indicator. So let's concentrate our effort to our attention to developing that kind of new measure. So, and then I also want to emphasize that this communique emphasizes the G7, G20 dashboard, because global leaders make a large number of pledges and commitments every G7 or G20 summit, and then ministers' meetings produce, again, the large number of commitments. And then nobody knows what happened to the previous commitments. Are they being implemented, or what the difference between the previous one and then the previous one was really bad. That's why the new one, new commitment is being made. So nobody is really checking. So, and there may be a lot of waste of resources. So we want to monitor and then make the those, result of monitoring useful for the new policy making. So we propose the kind of initiation of the design of such dashboard. Okay. So those things are written, and then also this afternoon I went to the Prime Minister's office to hand over this communique, and then I said, well, we didn't forget that we include the Japan's kind of policy stance, like nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. Okay, and then now I would like to listen to you about your kind of feedback. So, starting from the Professor Dennis Snow, who was who is the founder and president of Global Solutions Initiative, and who was T7 Germany lead chair last year, and he is also a T7 Japan task force co-chair and advisor. So, what's your view about this bridging the G7 and the G20, and then also through the T7 and T20, and also dashboard idea?
I'm absolutely delighted to have this question, because it is very clear, as Anna-Katrina Hornich and I also agreed last year under the German G7 presidency, that the planet, the world, is at an absolutely critical stage now. There are instabilities that could be disastrous for us if we do not pull together in our capacity as humanity to address them. Climate change, biodiversity loss, just being two of major challenges that also extend into the economic and social domain as well. And therefore, the necessity to tackle global challenges as participants of a global whole is absolutely essential if we are to survive on this planet. And consequently, it is essential for the G7 to work in a constructive way with its counterparts within the G20 in order to achieve this goal. And the high-income countries have a lot of comparative advantages in helping other countries reach this level of ambition. We need to help one another in order to achieve this goal, and G7 countries have something that is useful for the emerging and developing world to do so. And therefore, I think it's important to just keep in mind the main aspects that have been highlighted in this communique, and also to keep in mind the idea of the dashboard that Dean Tsunobe has just introduced, because over the years we have accumulated agreements and commitments that we do not regularly comply with. And the essential nature of coming together as humanity to deal with urgent problems is that there is broad-based decision-making that is inclusive, in which everyone who needs to be on the table is heard on that table. But then there is monitoring of agreed-on decisions and consequences for helpful and unhelpful behavior. And the dashboard is absolutely essential for the monitoring, and the G7 and G20 should then take this as an incentive to think about the rewards and punishments for helpful and unhelpful behavior, because without that, I think an organized society cannot exist. And with regard to global problems like climate change and biodiversity loss, we must consider this global community as a society.
Thank you very much, Dennis. So dashboard is very difficult to make. So I think without the cooperation of all the experts in the world, it will be impossible. So I hope that it will be a kind of a little bit similar to Wikipedia, so voluntary base and open architecture. And a difference would be Wikipedia is anonymous, but this dashboard, writer's name should be credit should be given to the writer. Okay, so and that will also includes measurement of the human well-being. Otherwise, we cannot see the real impact of those commitments and agreements. So this is also a difficult task. So and then to achieve this, the think tanks, the networks, and the convening power will play a big role, I think. And then, so that will help the achievement of the 2030 agenda. So I'd like to ask Anna Katarina. Sorry, I stopped, introducing the positions and those things to save time. So Anna Katarina, so for you, I'd like to ask kind of your perspective about our motto of reigniting sustainable development and the impact of the T Fora on the Agenda 2030.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for being interested in the communiqué. I think it's excellent. Thank you, Dean, for assuring that we can, that you submitted it already, we can discuss it here. I want to start maybe by saying, I mean, since years we observe on all continents and in all types of societies a number of social polarization processes. The societal cohesion is weakened, and we observe these social polarization processes as said, across all continents and in societies of high-income economies, middle-income and low-income economies. So it seems to be sort of a global process, and in a number of countries, the social polarization processes go hand in hand with political autocratization processes. This is one larger trend, and the other large trend we observe since years is the weakening of our multilateral structures and systems in place. And in the past few years, and also once more accelerated, I would say, by Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine, we observe that, well, there's basically two agendas only that our international community can continue agreeing to. One is the Agenda 2030, and the other is the Paris Climate Agreement. These are the two agendas and global agreements that have been reaffirmed in the past year as well, and despite the differences in place. But I refer to the longer-term processes, social polarization and autocratization process, and the weakening of our multilateral systems, in order to remind us of the fact that in many ways we are at a tipping point, one could say, of that decides, or during which we decide whether we more and more move into a multipolar world that is united by some agreements that we continue to agree on, such as the Agenda 2030, or whether we move into a world that is characterized by multiple orders, so also multipolar, but no longer bound by some of the multilateral agreements in place. And I think that's a very crucial, we are at a very crucial state here with regard to this question. And due to this, it's important, and I think a big achievement to also within this communiqué to underline the importance of the Agenda 2030, remind ourselves of its three core pillars or principles, one could say. One, its universality. Sustainable development is a universal challenge and job and necessity. Of its indivisibility, these 17 goals, they cannot be divided, but they are always standing in relationship to each other. And third, its inclusivity. It was organized, it was shaped as an agenda that guides action through a 2-year bottom-up process involving, or at least attempting to involve, many different groups of world society. These are big achievements of the Agenda 2030, and at the same time we know the implementation is substantially lagging behind. The sort of era or the range of goals, of course, allows for substantial cherry picking in its implementation, and the implementation has been further weakened by the debt crisis, by COVID-19, etc. We have to be aware of this, but at the same time now invest already into, on the one side, accelerating implementation again, reflecting on a post-COVID remembering basically of the Agenda 2030 and accelerating implementation and action, and as part of this assuring the financing for it. We've yesterday discussed the UN Secretary General's proposition of the SDG stimulus. We've also pointed to the conference upcoming in June in Paris around questions of SDG financing. We have the summit, the SDG summit, happening on the UN level in New York in September, mid-September this year. We have the process in place for the Summit of the Future that will take place next year in September in New York. So we have a few milestones, one could say, in the ongoing year and in the next year that we need to contribute to and find ways that the G7, hopefully also the G20, contributes to and mobilizes for awareness and action in order to now create the basis for then from 2028 onwards, assuring that also post-2030 we will have a joint agenda and an agenda that brings together ecological and climatic biodiversity concerns with social, poverty-related inequality and debt crisis-related concerns as well as economic concerns. With this,
okay. So thank you very much. Excellent points, and Katarina. Now we are moving from Germany to India. And Susan, Ambassador Chinoy. So I inserted my view of the role of the think tanks in this communique. And my view is the core part of the think tanks, role is the convening. Convening power is very important for think tanks. And then, so, Ambassador, so what's your view about the convening role of think tanks to address the multiple crises?
Thank you, Dean Sonobe. I want to begin by firstly congratulating you and your brilliant team. I can see Kaori-san also sitting there. Many others behind the scenes who have supported you in bringing us all together. So I want to acknowledge that and place on record our deep appreciation. It's not a one-off event. I can see that right from the word go, the T7 has sought to engage the T20 just as much as the T20 has tried to engage the T7 and the rest of the world as well. So with that, I should also acknowledge the role that think tanks can play in this space. I think the world is today far too complex to be left only to governments to handle. As they say, war is too far serious a matter to be left to generals alone. And so the complexity of global challenges today is such that we must tap the expertise that is available outside of government. Sensible governments also do their best to bring in expertise into government from the outside through a revolving door policy. And I think, therefore, this is a very, very crucial juncture. This point of inflection where we are today, in fact, enhances the importance of think tanks. Although the think tank scene is, like the rest of the world, a rather sort of fractured scene, it's not fragmented. Think tanks also speak to one another, although they have different identities, sometimes different expertise and background, and sometimes even driven by different ideologies. But at the end of the world, the canvas on which think tanks operate is still one that allows such interconnectedness in countries and internationally. And therefore, I think this is something that we greatly welcome. The T7, as you know, is relatively a nascent organization, 2 years old. The T20, which began, I think, with the G20 summit in Mexico, has a decade or more of experience under its belt. As far as the G20 presidency of India is concerned, I must point out that the focus is essentially on global economic recovery, climate change, how to sustain biodiversity, how to sort of achieve the SDGs at an early date, and how to bring about genuine reforms in the multilateral development banks, the international financial institutions, as well as the apex decision-making structures like the UN, the WTO, etc. And so we see that India's presidency is aimed, and therefore by inference, the T20 itself this year is focused on these issues. The motto is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That's an old Sanskrit shloka from the Maha Upanishad, which essentially means that the world is one family. And therefore the motto is one earth, one family, one future. Now, what I would mention at this point is that the world is in flux. Multilateralism has been greatly eroded and weakened, but multipolarity is on the rise. Essentially, we are living now in an era in which decision-making has run into some kind of stasis. The UN, especially the UN Security Council, is racked by absolute divisions there. And one might say, rather churlishly, that permanent members are also hoist on their own petard, because there is a veto system there, a privileged exceptionalism that hasn't permitted decision-making. The WTO is equally in shambles in terms of dispute settlement or negotiations. And we can see that this space has become very complex. So there is no single country that is today in a position to call all the shots on all issues at all times. And in this kind of complex world, I think it is better that we hang in together. The G20 provides that kind of vehicle. It is much more representative than many other bodies. It has the G7, which has a distinct identity, but it also has many of the others, including, all importantly, from the global south, the countries that are otherwise not in the reckoning. And so I would really welcome this dialogue between G20 and G7 at the government levels, but also a dialogue between T20 and T7. And we must see what exactly is that low-hanging fruit. Beyond the differences, we must zero in on the convergences. That's the priority. And the convergences are many, as I've seen from our own discourse, in terms of larger issues like climate change and healthcare in particular. It is a no-brainer that taking very nationalistic country positions, being tardy in terms of meeting financial commitments, etc., is not going to be helpful, because you really cannot do anything about climate change unless you have everybody on board. And in the global south, there is the urgency which drives them to continue to use fossil fuels, including coal. There is debt distress, there is lack of finance. And so if they are not helped with technology, if they are not helped with other commitments, in any case, climate action will fail. Healthcare likewise. So these are things on which we must see how best we can join forces. On the digital side, I just want to express a concern. India has great experience of the India stack. Many of you have heard about the great success of the India stack. This is a phenomenal success for India, where India has literally the world's largest number of transactions daily in the digital space, where the identity, bank accounts, and so on and so forth have been seamlessly combined with multiple other private layers coming on in terms of data access, etc. And it's very low cost as well. And so it's a model that could be replicated for the global south, the Indian model. I say this because the digital space gives me the impression today that it could lead to digital colonization if digital public infrastructure is not really open and accessible. And it's a fact that the rules of the road, the servers, the data flows, the technologies in this space, especially in the digital space and IT and cyber, is loaded in favor of the developed countries. So unless we do something about that, we will be soon entering an era in which the global south will be greatly disadvantaged. So once again, thank you very much. I really welcome this dialogue. Want to congratulate you once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sujan. So the convening power and the bridging ideas, and also I would like to remind you that the think tanks are inseparably related to the knowledge, education, and then also science. And then, interestingly, this communique include the idea of importance of education or 21st century education in the reducing achieving the climate change mitigation and adaptation, just as Beth King emphasized before the lunchtime. So teaching the skills in contributing to the mitigation and adaptation can be very, very useful solution to that big problem. And then also, of course, science. And not only just giving more, subsidy for the public, the R&D, and also increasing the budget for public R&D investments, but more, so beyond finance type, promotion and the utilization of science and scientific knowledge to policy making. So, Sachin, you have been emphasizing the important relationship between our cooperation between think tanks and science, right? So, from your perspective, how do you think this communique, and also you are leading, one of the leaders of the T20 India, so how to push your belief into the T20 India?
Thank you. Thanks, Dean Sonobe-san. I joined the panel in congratulating ADBI for this leadership and this very comprehensive document that you have come up with. And I think the way last 2 days were planned, the sessions that were organized, and Anna Katerina led us through this very important panel on science. And I think this was one very interesting addition which your sort of document, and right in your initial remarks, the inaugural remarks, you had connected the idea of leveraging science, technology, and innovation for the kind of global solutions that we need. And that, I think, gave us the whole concept, which probably next week some of us would be discussing at the UN on STI for SDG at the Science Technology Forum that would be organized. And I think this is Japan's leadership from Japan's G20 presidency. So the project that Japan launched during its G20 presidency was to have STI for SDG, Science, Technology, Innovation for Sustainable Development Goals. And this project, then Prime Minister Abe persuaded Prime Minister Modi. Both of them accepted, and at UN General Assembly in 2018, we launched STI for SDG as a project. Fortunately, in India, the project was given to my institute, RIS, and we implemented that with our principal scientific advisor. And 5 African countries are on board. So next week in New York, we are reporting the developments in the project under STI for SDG. So this is something very close to my heart, and I was delighted to see that this document captures the essence of STI and development. And I think from that perspective, 3 points, Sonobe-san, are important. One is in terms of emphasis on open sourcing. And I'm so glad to see in the text the idea of open sourcing that has emerged extremely well. Prime Minister in India has been talking about this. The S20 in India has already met and discussed open sourcing as a solution in terms of addressing the development barriers that we have. The second important part that you have mentioned is in terms of bringing new technologies for food security. And that, I think, has emerged quite well, both in terms of leveraging biodiversity, but also in terms of bringing in centrality and universality for SDG agenda. And this, I think, would be extremely important for us. As far as our G20 presidency is concerned and the possible relevant points, I find almost 9 points are extremely important in your the G7 declared, the T7 declaration, which probably would be reflective of the G7 priorities, but we also very much link ourselves with that idea. And I think the first and foremost I find is the T7, T20 dashboard. And supplementing what John Curtin and others have been doing, the Global Solution has been doing, I think it would supplement that effort. But first and foremost, I think the emphasis on IMF reforms is something that we all have been arguing, we all have been pressing for that. Adequate emphasis in the document has been given. As Anna Katerina mentioned, debt crisis is very well reflected, and I think it captures the essence. SDG 2030 agenda is important. What Dennis mentioned in terms of joint research initiative for multi-year, I think is reflective of our collective commitment for bridging the knowledge gap that Ambassador Chenoy referred to. And I think think tanks have to do this exercise. So with your leadership and the leadership that Germany exhibited during the T7 presidency, we have come together. The entities are not different. Probably we are providing leadership to the governments to converge the agenda. But I think there are gaps, and this requires joint research. We sitting together and working out, and I think a multi-year research project would be extremely important. I was quite delighted to see emphasis in the communique on ethics and value systems. This is very, very close to my heart, and I think is absolutely important, particularly when countries have taken this high pedestal of preaching others and not practicing what they are preaching. So as a result, there is huge gap in our understanding, and I think ethics is not abstract. It is very much, in my view, what I call as AEI, access, equity, and inclusion. So all three have to go together, and that's what I think is important. The sixth point I see, and Ambassador Chenoy mentioned about it, is to support digital infrastructure. Huge debate is on. The IMF meeting report has emphasized in terms of sparing resources, particularly suggesting it to the regional development banks to give it a priority. I think ADB and others would have to take heads on this huge deficit that we have, and I think would be important. And I'm extremely glad that you have emphasized on reminding us of the $100 billion which are missing from the scene. So I was glad to see that line, and I think it helps in terms of taking the collective agenda forward, particularly when you are also emphasizing on resilient human resource development strategies that we need, and I think that would be important. Last but not the least is the whole emphasis on investing in global science systems, and that I think has given the huge fillip that we require. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sachin. And now moving from Sachin from India to Feliciano from Brazil for the obvious reason. And then my question is, whenever I say bridging G7 and G20, you say you felt strange, odd. So because you are keen about this kind of grouping, right? So G7, BRICS, and G20, and then also explain a little bit about that subtle difference, and also the which areas for the major cooperation among them.
Thank you very much. Well, my name is Feliciano. I'm from the Brazilian Center of International Relations, and we will be one of the think tanks hosting the G20 2024 in Brazil. So you're all invited and welcome to go to Brazil next year. Thank you very much for the questions. We just had a previous meeting before, and I'm new at the G20, G7 conversations, and it was striking for me that there was a difference between what G7 is and G20 is, apart from, and the G7 is part of the G20. So it was a little odd for me. And when I was asked to think about areas of cooperation between the G7 and the G20, thinking about what what we're planning for Brazil next year, I identified here, even and to help a little bit of the dashboard between G20 and the G7, 3 levels of cooperation between the two, which is a major level cooperation, issues on that, an intermediate level cooperation, in an area that I can call where there is less cooperation or even competition between what the G7 and the G13, which is the rest of the G7. So I think major areas of cooperation have been pointed out here very well: climate change, green transition. In the case of Brazil, green finance towards tropical forests, the SDG agenda, which is very important. Another issue that I think it's already showing up here in the communiqué. There is a whole chapter about item about that, and I was very pleased to see that, which is food security and zero hunger programs related to sustainable agriculture. This is an area that a country like Brazil and many others from the G7, G10 can cooperate. The whole 2030 agenda is also an area of strong cooperation between G7 and G20. Measurement of well-being, digital governance, and science and education cooperation, as you just mentioned. These are what I think 6 areas of major cooperation between G7 and G20 countries. I think an area that I call intermediate level of cooperation is reform international institutions. As mentioned here before, the difficulties in reforming the United Nations Security Council, the stalemate there, the difficulty in reforming the IMF and the World Bank. Although some reforms have been made in the last 10 years, there's still a lot to be done. And also something that is it's very controversial in Brazil and relating to Brazil's international position, which is the rise of international institutions more or less led by China, like BRICS, the New Development Bank, and the AIIB. So any discussion about reforming international institutions, there's going to be always some stalemate and difficulties between the G7 and the G20. In an area where I think there is much less cooperation between these two groupings, if you say, is defense and security. The Russian factor and the China's rise creates tensions within BRICS countries and between G7 and G20. So I think something that we already noticed in the presidency of India this year, I think will continue to happen next year. In the area of international finance, I don't know if you're following, there is this whole discussion amongst BRICS countries of the de-dollarization of their transactions. This is important for BRICS countries. It's very small, this process, but tends to grow, and I think this is going to be an area of tension between these two groups. The other day I saw on the news that 19 countries have either formally or informally requested to join BRICS, and there is a whole I participated last week in a discussion about with several think tanks from the BRICS countries, and there is this discussion going on, what are the rules? So how can we take in more countries within the BRICS? And how is every country in the BRICS going to have a veto power? How is that going to play out? I think if there is any tension in the G7 and the G20, it's not between G7 and G20, but between BRICS and G7. So I think this is going to be a point of tension for the conference next year. So thank you very much for this invitation. And again, everyone is invited to come to Brazil in 2024 to participate. I see a lot of smiles and people, woohoo, this is very nice. Thank you very much. So it's going to be probably, we're going to have a conference probably, we don't know yet, in Rio for the first one, and then São Paulo, and then Rio again. So you're all invited. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good luck on the T20 Brazil. And then moving on to the Italy. So Antonio, what can we expect from Italian T20 next year? And is there any continuity from the Japan T20?
Well, actually, there is no agenda of the G7 so far announced by the government, just a few declarations, few statements from some ministers of Meloni's government. But if I also consider what is the guiding principle of the Think7 Japan, which has this holistic view of the world, well, it reminds me the motto of the Italian G20 in 2021, people, planet, prosperity, which is basically the same thing. We have been talking about human security, comprehensive security in Task Force 4 of T7. So I think that, there is really room for high continuity, even because Italy and Japan, quite surprisingly, because we are geographically very far, but they have so much in common, not necessarily good things. For instance, when it comes to the very high public debt, even if the composition of the debt is quite different, demographic trends, which of course we share, aging population, especially with Japan and so on. So there is no agenda so far, but I think that knowing a bit, what is also the mood of the new Italian government, I have some expectations of what is going to be on the agenda. First, of course, the elephant in the room, the Ukraine war, will be a key priority for the G7 as it was last year. It will draw a lot of energy from the cooperation among also the leaders of the G7. Of course, an emerging topic in this regard will be the reconstruction of Ukraine, hopefully, the sooner the better, even if, of course, we don't know when this war will be over and how. So, security for sure, but then economy. And when it comes to economy, well, cooperation in the monetary field and especially the avoidance of a new financial crisis will definitely will be a key issue for Italy. Again, Italy and Japan, they have a very high public debt. Any financial instability will take its toll on Italy and Japan in terms of higher interest rates, for instance. So that's why, of course, a big attention will be paid, in my view, to the role of financial stability and, in particular, to the working and functioning of the framework beyond the SSI, even because it was created during the Italian G20. So there is, in a way, this interest in Italy to make it work as much as possible. Then, of course, the third pillar, in my view, is the climate part. On this, there is already a declaration made one of the ministers, of the Italian ministers, and also this morning we talked about it with Ettore, is food security will be definitely one of the key points of the Italian G7. So it means, making some agreements among G7 countries and much beyond, of course, to ensure to ensure food security, including, of course, price stability. This will be definitely a key question, and it will be very much tied also to the quality of food, which is another topic on which, of course, Italy is very much interested. Last but not least, I think that some efforts will be made by Italy when it comes to international trade. Italy in the broader context, of course, of the European Union, fair international trade and dependence on key materials and rare earth materials. These are sensitive issues in which I expect something of coming from the Italian T7. I stop here, but there is also the colleague now.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Then finally, last but not least, Ettore, thank you very much for coming. I met you for my first time just less than 1 month ago in a cafe in a hotel in Tokyo. And thank you very much for coming back to Tokyo within 1 month. And my question is about the new forms of cooperation with Global South. And also, if you want to talk, and then please add peace issues.
Okay, many thanks, dear Sonobe, and good afternoon, everyone. And congratulations for being able to draft such an inspiring document with a set of insightful ideas and proposals. We know how difficult is this process, but it's a very rewarding one. And in fact, the task for us as think tanks is exactly to provide this type of policy-oriented proposal to seek the closest possible interaction with governments to have an impact on policy making. I would indeed expect engagement with the South, Global South, and the North-South dialogue to remain and to be increasingly at the center of the G7 agenda. It certainly applies to Italy's presidency of G7 next year. The focus on engagement with so-called Global South has two compelling reasons for the G7 members that they are mutually reinforcing. First, we know that no major global issues can be solved without a closer structural partnership with developing countries. Second, we know that G7 members do also have strategic and geopolitical interest in improving relations with developing countries. I would just only add that this phrase Global South is a little bit controversial and may even become obsolete at a certain point, since those countries have very different institutional and economic structures and also different political orientation. And this is, by the way, what makes for any single country to establish itself as a champion of the Global South. The fact remains, of course, that several qualifying objectives of G7 have little chances to be achieved unless new forms of cooperation with developing countries are built. We should recognize that the G7 has a fairly limited membership and so a limited legitimacy to address global issues, but at the same time, the G7 has the ambition of playing a global role. So filling this gap is, we should recognize, a daunting challenge, and this requires that essentially the G7 countries come to terms with the rapidly changing balance in the world order and consider more seriously the possibility of reforming the multilateral governance structures to make them more legitimate and inclusive. We should say that there remains a stronger resistance within the G7 to do that. And I would argue that a change of attitude in this regard is a prerequisite, a key prerequisite to have a meaningful dialogue with developing countries. Concretely, I would mention three crucial areas in which the G7 can play a major role in advancing engagement with developing countries. The first is development finance. That's a crucial area to bridge the North-South divide, we know. One urgent problem is the fragmentation of the current inadequate efforts to deal with the worrying debt crisis in developing countries. In order to mitigate this crisis, it is essential that functional synergies are created among major debt relief mechanism and initiative, and all creditor countries should be involved in this effort, which should be in principle a multilateral one. Beyond that, the G7 also could be well-equipped forum to advance discussion on the reform of the development finance system, but also the Bretton Woods institution as a whole. A second area is food security, which has already been mentioned, and more specifically how to create and improve the resilience of food agriculture systems. We know how devastating the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine have been, with a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable countries. So the most urgent priority I see is to ensure, first of all, the continued renewal of the UN-mediated agreement on grain exports from the Black Sea, and to counter renewed attempts to use food as a means of destabilization. But beyond that, in order to protect the developing countries from the impact of similar crises in the future, there is the need, I think this need is widely felt, to reform the agriculture system and restructure also the supply chains. These vulnerabilities have been highlighted during the current crisis, but even before. This is a field where I think North-South cooperation can make concrete progress, and the G7 can have a significant role in that regard. And final area is global health. This is an area where the G20 presidency of Italy put a big emphasis. The G7 can contribute to renewing the efforts undertaken during the pandemic to help developing countries to enhance their health systems. There are some ongoing initiatives in this regard. The plans launched during the pandemic so far achieved very limited results, and indeed they need to be renewed and also updated and reviewed. So it's not by chance that I have mentioned those three areas, because these are likely to be on the top of Italy's presidency of the G7 next year. One of the tasks of my institute, both our institute, will be to channel to the Italian government the proposal and suggestion coming out from the T7 and the proposal made in this framework, which are very insightful again. And so I am very much look forward to next steps in this very valued exercise. I would like to thank again the ADBI and Dian Sonobe for this excellent work they have done to promote these discussions.
Thank you very much, Attore. So thank you very much, everyone, for your patience, and thank you very much for your great stamina. And with this, I would like to close this great summit. But I would like to say that T7 Japan is now standing at a turnaround point in this very long process of T7 until it will last until our handover of T7 to Italy. So it will take place in sometime in November, I think. And then before that, first of all, there will be a G7 Hiroshima summit on May 19 and 20. And before that, there is a Global Solutions Summit. And before that, T20 India mid-year conference. And then after Hiroshima summit, there will be a global policy forum at the ISP, and then the big conference, I forgot the name, sorry, but EI. And then, as you know, there are many, many important conferences. Then maybe we will continue. And then also now we are adding the new task of making dashboard. And then the first step is to monitor what is discussed by the global leaders at the G7 Hiroshima and then G20 India. So our activities will continue, and we will have more and more gathering workshops and conferences online and also in person or hybrid. So please join us more and more to make this think tank communities work more fruitful, and let us contribute more to the global peace and prosperity. Okay. Thank you very much.